I'm Dr. Karen Frances McCarthy. I specialise in contemporary American spectral literature to explore how modern fiction presents themes of continued consciousness, takes new approaches to spirituality and narrative empathy, and explores new pathways for understanding life's emotional and spiritual dimensions. The intersection of religion and contemporary spectral fiction raises the question of whether literature can be considered a sacred text. Literature and religion have a long intersected history. Writers drawing inspiration from religious themes and imagery is nothing new. Religion set the stage for modern theatre by inspiring much of medieval Europe's mystery dramas, miracle and morality plays. The stories of Moses and Jesus have been retold in plays, poems, novels, and films to explore the essentiality of religious figures to human life. Dante's Divine Comedy, Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, Milton's Paradise Lost, the Epic of Gilgamesh contribute language and imagery to the religio-literary tradition that helps to create a sense of the sacred by giving meaning and greater purpose to the human condition. So we know that religious or sacred texts have been translated into literature for millennia, but is the reverse true? Can literature translate into textual sacredness? The answer rests on determining what constitutes a sacred text. Religious discourse is generally associated with scriptures, sermons, prayers, and hymns that share spiritual truths, affirm human connection to the divine, offer moral guidance and promise immortality, and create rituals and practices to facilitate mystical experiences. However, this is not found solely within the religious texts. Some contemporary theorists maintain that texts can be made sacred by how they are held and used. Salman Rushdie, for example, maintains that nothing is sacred in and of itself, and that ideas, texts, and even people can be made sacred. Theologian Paul Tillich considers all forms of religion and religious texts to be the results of creativity. He writes, "There is no sacred language which has fallen from a supernatural heaven and been put between the covers of a book, but there is a human language based on man's encounter with reality, changing through the millennia, used for the needs of daily life, for expression and communication, for literature and poetry, and also for the expression and communication of our ultimate concerns." If textual sacralization, therefore, is a product of how the text is used to communicate human concerns and offer spiritual guidance, then the contemporary American novel, which presents a spiritual syncretism of postsecular ideas around the idea of the self, the spirit, connection to the divine, or to something greater than the self, could be considered sacred. To understand how the spectral novel can be read as sacred, we must first understand the concept of postsecularism and how it manifests in spectral novels. While the term postsecular has had different permutations, it's attributed to social theorist Jürgen Habermas, who defines it as neither a rejection of the secular nor as a return to religion. It has grown out of the post-Enlightenment condition, appealing to those seeking a deeper sense of meaning in contemporary society. The decline of the Church's influence, the rise of Enlightenment rationalism, the Darwinian challenge to biblical authority, and Freudian psychology have meant that the search for wisdom and meaning has revolved around secularized and psychological narratives. Scientific and technological advancements have reduced the need for an omnipotent being to control contingencies. Yet sacralization failed to become a purveyor of existential meaning. In the post-Enlightenment era, the absence of a sense of connection to a larger cosmic order and the assumption that individuals are predisposed towards rational skepticism has produced the problem of meaninglessness, an epidemic of loneliness, and a search for personal and spiritual meaning. In the 1960s and 70s, for example, this search for meaning gave rise to new religious movements that drew largely on Eastern philosophy, the countercultural movement, and challenges to sacredly held concepts of reality by new physics. As the countercultural revolution aimed at freeing people's minds, most famously encapsulated in Harvard psychology professor Timothy Leary's phrase, "turn on, tune in, and drop out," Eastern religions and mindfulness presented an attractive alternative to what was perceived as a Western spiritual vacuum. The 1970s saw the emergence of monists who believed that everything exists as part of the same unified oneness. The decade saw the arrival of nuns who subscribe to no one religion, and the spiritual but not religious movement who see their spiritual journey as inherently personal. None of these groups subscribe to any transcendent deity, but focus on personal beliefs and individual responsibility. Most hold the pantheistic belief that all things are part of the divine, along with an openness to, but not an over-reliance on scientism. This grounds the new religious movements in a search for subjective, sacred, or mystical experiences and a connection to the absolute in the unfathomable universe that science has presented. The postsecular is not an attack upon Enlightenment narratives, nor a surrender to theological grand narratives. It affirms love, community, and nature, along with, as literature scholar Manavrati notes, faith, awe, wonder, and transcendence, infusing everyday life with richness, imagination, and inspiration. From this emerges the sacredness of a world grounded in the wider culture that removes conditioned thinking of separateness and othering, which John McClure notes appeals to the religiously unhoused but spiritually hungry who bring critical thinking and progressive political ideas to spirituality. This brings us to liminal spaces. These approaches to spirituality are particularly evident in the contemporary spectral fiction that percolates within the post-secular swell of cultural, religious, and scientific thought. The fictional liminal spaces lend to imaginative explorations of life, death, and the afterlife, fulfilling a contemporary need that Victor Turner describes in The Ritual Process. He writes, liminality, marginality, and structural inferiority are conditions in which are frequently generated myths, symbols, rituals, philosophical systems, and works of art. In this way, the liminal condition creates new myths and reference for the current era to replace those lost in the secularization thesis. As a liminal figure, the ghost has been remarkably versatile throughout literary history as a revenant returned to a spectral existence among the living, a figure of mental disturbance, a symbol of trauma, or a social or political metaphor. It has had an enduring, if not thorny, association with religion. The spectre has been caught in theological conflict since the Reformation, which eliminated the Catholic purgatory. It is out of place in time, a figure of the past intruding on the present. It has been both angel and demon, an animating principle of life and an aspect of the divine. It should be in heaven or hell, but remains in an ambiguous state, clinging, lingering, and haunting the living. The contemporary ghost, however, has given up haunting and is itself haunted. It exists in complex, non-theological, multi-dimensional afterlife spaces that embody a post-secular ethos around grand narratives to reflect the disconnection, confusion, and loss of personal value and meaning in contemporary life. These ghost narratives do not turn back to religion for meaning, but towards a curated syncretism of beliefs and practices in a space that explores the illusion of self and our intrinsic interconnectedness. The grand theological narrative that promises binaries of heaven or hell, reward or retribution is discarded along with spectral stereotypes in favor of a post-secular sensibility that emphasizes interbeing, empathy, truth, and service as ritualistic actions that induce mystical or enchanted experiences, offer a sacred repository of morality and wisdom, and challenge the reader to transcend a small sense of selfness in service to the mystery of the whole. Two contemporary spectral novels that reflect these ultimate concerns are Five People You Meet in Heaven by the New York Times bestselling author Mitch Albom and Lincoln in the Bardo by Man Booker Prize winner George Saunders. In Five People You Meet in Heaven, the main character, Eddie, maintains the rides at a seaside amusement park called Ruby Pier. He is a World War II veteran and a former prisoner of war who suffers from post-traumatic stress and the pain of physical injuries sustained on the front. His traumatic experiences extend farther into the past, to a childhood of poverty, scarcity, and hopelessness at the hands of a neglectful and physically abusive father. He dies at 83, trying to save a child from an accident on one of the rides after what he considers was a meaningless life. Upon awakening in liminal space, he finds no theological promises, no reunions, rewards, or retributions. He meets a character called the Blue Man. "But now I gotta pay," he said. "To pay? For my sin. That's why I'm here, right? Justice?" The Blue Man smiled. "No, Edward. You are here so I can teach you something. All the people you meet here have one thing to teach you." As a PTSD sufferer, his expectations of punishment are quickly relieved by meeting 5 spectres with whom he was connected in physical life. These spectres help him understand the intricate web of how lives intersect and how all lives and actions matter. And within that, life's overarching purpose. Alban's 5 People reads like a contemporary American fable. Its narrative simplicity reflects the fears and fantasies of what it means to be human and mortal in 21st century, particularly in America, where individual grapples with an increasing fear of personal uselessness, disconnection, and meaninglessness in a society that lauds wealth and celebrity. George Saunders' more narratively complex novel also reflects this postsecular spiritual syncretism. Taking place on a single day in 1862, Lincoln in the Bardo is set around the death of Abraham Lincoln's 11-year-old son Willie from typhoid fever. The boy's death is set against the backdrop of the American Civil War at a time when the Union was also suffering significant casualties. The novel unfolds along 2 narrative threads. One includes fragments of the historical record, and the other is told from the perspective of a group of spectres who live in liminal space called the Bardo. Their inner traumas manifest as outward deformities. The catalyst of the story is Lincoln's clinging to Willie's body and the child's determination to stay with his father, which carries the potential of the child being consumed by a hideous carapace of the most malevolent ghosts. 3 ghosts, Bevins, Volman, and the Reverend Thomas, take it upon themselves to save the boy. Their efforts are intermittently haunted by the appearance of what's called a matter light blooming phenomena, the term that they use for the sudden and terrifying fire sound that brings supposed angels to the Bardo who try, but fail, to convince them to leave. The literary form frees Saunders from theological imperatives to explore concepts of truth, reward, redemption, heaven or hell, within siloed religious paradigms. There is a natural flow from Christian and Buddhist elements in the novel. Saunders explained in an interview that he felt that Christianity did a lot of urging one to be good, but didn't tell one much about how to accomplish that, how to change, how to convert one's way of thinking and being in the world. He goes on to say that then he and his wife encountered Tibetan Buddhism and found a tradition that offered real practices that a person could do every day. And almost immediately, he says, I could feel myself changing. This fusion is reflected in the subtle reference to John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress in Saunders' novel. While the quest of Bevins, Thomas, and Volman to save Willie echoes the challenges, imaginative realities, fears, shames, temptations, and despair that Christian faces in The Pilgrim's Progress, Saunders is not a Christian quest through Catholic purgatory. Without a deity, no judgment, redemption, or reward can be dispensed. Unlike the 3 angels who give Christian gifts, the Bardo angels who try to move the ghosts into the uncertainty beyond the Bardo are greeted with distrust, because these ghosts have shaped their identity around trauma and valuelessness. And they cannot accept that they deserve help, nor can they conceive of restoration. When Reverend Thomas arrives in the Bardo, he willingly goes into the matter light blooming phenomenon, confident that his life of ministry will be met with reward. But this is not what he finds. Thomas is joined on his journey by a man from Pennsylvania who acts like a vacuous tourist embarking on a new adventure, and also by an angry man from Maine who drowned while swimming. The 3 men advance up a mountain trail as if ascending the hill of Calvary. But Thomas's vision quickly becomes more like the Inferno. They arrive before what Thomas calls a Christ emissary and a gathering of spirits. Thomas's naivety that his salvation rests in a fair and benevolent God is quickly destroyed, along with the expectation that the angry man from Maine will be damned and the happy man from Pennsylvania will be saved. As the narrative appropriates disparate cultural elements into its syncretism, each man's heart is weighed in what resembles an Egyptian ritual based on the belief that the heart records all of the good and bad deeds of a person's life. The angry man's heart is weighed and judged favorably, and he is rewarded. The happy man from Pennsylvania, however, has a heavier heart and is ushered into a tent of flesh, where he is tortured, while onlookers screeched with joy. Thomas's vision denies the spirit of Christ or Buddha nature within all beings. He flees back to the bardo, unable to release his identity that's bound up and buried in his vestments. He is left tormented and damned and impotent. His confusion, disenchantment, and abdication of personal power to an unreliable theological narrative places him in a state where he tells Willie, "I remain ignorant of what sin I committed. My ledger stands just as it did on that awful day. I have done nothing to improve it since, for there is nothing to do in this place where no action can matter." However, disconsolation can be relieved in the unlikely space of the bardo. Eventually, most of the spectres go into the grieving Lincoln to influence his thoughts to accept his son's death and let him go. This act of service gives them a sense of purpose and value that they lacked in life and in death. Transformed by the personal value they find in useful and unitive service to another, allows them to let go of their traumas, their small sense of selfness, to follow the angels beyond the bardo into the next stage of a multi-dimensional afterlife. In this way, both novels address redemption and become redemptive. Restoration from trauma, disconnection, and disconsolation is not found in psychology, in divine salvation, or Buddhist rebirth, despite Saunders' title. The thrust of the narratives towards spectral restoration to wholeness arises from the spectre's choice to release egoic concepts of the self in service to the well-being of another. The desire to be part of something meaningful beyond the self drives both novels. The spectral narrative opens a space to explore restoration through postsecular values of community, altruism, love, compassion, enlightenment, and an understanding of the world of the other, where we can transcend through ritual actions of service, not through blind obedience to an almighty. This echoes Turner's idea of the communitas, a term he used to describe a sense of heightened solidarity experienced through moments of ritual that inspire people to step out of conditioned social roles. The communitas, he writes, breaks through the interstices of structure in liminality. By stepping out of liminal concepts of selfness for another, the spectres in both novels come to reflect the moral imperative within the sacred. The synergy of philosophies woven into the narratives suggests the spectres are not facing a spiritual trajectory to paradise or nirvana, but an epistemological journey from ignorance to realization, a restorative journey from trauma to healing, and significantly, a re-enchanted understanding of the truth of our interconnection. The liminal space of the spectral novel becomes the new religio-literary frontier, where spectres are freed from theological narratives that would dispense reward or punishment. In presenting its particular form of redemption, the post-secular spectral novel assumes the role once assigned to religious doctrine by guiding the spectre through a world where the stabilizing role of established social structures, religious grand narratives, and even the bulwark of scientific understanding has been challenged and redefined in favor of a personal and unitive relationship with all that is. These novels do not offer answers to unanswerable ontological mysteries. We are not told what Alban's second heaven is or what lies beyond Saunders' bardo, but they do speak to a more complex contemporary need for spiritual dimensions to existence, not as a return to the dogma, ritual, and obeisance of organized religions, but to a curated post-secular syncretism of spirituality, a sense of sacredness, and a sense of meaning. While addressing concepts of oneness, compassion, And transcendence through sacrifice or service does not elevate the poet or the writer to the status of secular prophet. Poetic expression positions supernatural literature, which already intersects with religion and spirituality, as sacred in the post-secular climate of the 21st century. Here, it offers an alternative perspective on what informs the religious and spiritual experience in a culture where increasing numbers of people seek deeper meaning beyond strictly theological narratives. Of course, there was always the danger that without life-defining telos beyond the self, as literature scholar Tumantry Albury terms it, post-secular spirituality could be viewed less as sacred and more as self-help. Albury acknowledges a trend in American readership of approaching fiction as quasi-sacred repositories of wisdom, in which readers can reflect about characters like themselves and find examples of how to live their lives. In this context, approaching fiction as self-help can shift the focus to the self and away from the needs of the community, and the importance of an interconnected understanding more broadly, values that lie at the heart of the post-secular ethos. There is, however, a fundamental difference between self-help and a sacred text. In exploring the interrelationship of the literary and the theological, Andrew Hass considers 4 features that they jointly seem to fill: post-secularity, globalization, culturality, and interdisciplinarity, all of which exist in the inherent message of the contemporary spectral novel. So this brings us back to the question of how texts are held and used. If the difference between fiction and religious texts is conditioned upon how they are interpreted and used across disciplines, and if the value of sacred texts lies in their conveyance of spiritual truths, their affirmation of human connection to the divine, and moral guidance, the creation of rituals to facilitate mystical experiences and guidance for navigating challenges in life, matters that have traditionally been considered the remit of religion, the post-secular novel can arguably be considered a sacred text. By reconciling spirituality, Eastern and Western philosophy, rationalism, and scientific thought, the post-secular novel becomes what Terry Eagleton notes of literature more generally as an essential palliative for the failure of religious ideology and supplies us with various myths which are of relevance to social life. The novel becomes the porous membrane to which the self and the world flow into each other, offering a cohesive but transcendent narrative that recognizes the sacredness of being and believing in something greater than the self. In turn, by placing the spectre in liminal spaces beyond normal experiences, the spectral novels create a reality behind the perception of physicality to bring the reader into an ineffable space beyond themselves. This offers an opportunity for self-reflection that can enlarge our understanding of the spiritual nature of our age as an individual, curated, and self-reflective personal aspiration. In this way, the post-secular spectral novel, unbound by doctrine or dogmatic dictates, offers the space to explore the sensibilities that can lead to re-enchantment, redemption, and restoration. The text becomes a sacred repository of meaning and moral value that plays a significant role in presenting the conditions that make life sacred. Post-secular spectral fiction is born of our post-secular age. It is an acknowledgement in art of our loss of myth, meaning, and reliable reference. Its value exists in replacing complacency and discrimination with messages of hope, compassion, kindness, oneness, and a recognition of the existence of the mystery in the world. As George Saunders says, once a person has a glimpse of mystery, he is always going to be seeking that. This is the sacred message that spectral literature provides, a glimpse beyond the curtain into the vast mystery and meaning of life, a glimpse that even in the smallest way offers a transformative understanding of our part in and our responsibility to the empathetic, all-pervasive continuum of being.